if Yutimara wasn't going to Malaysian jail up to now comes the Israeli team to extend upon their case. Two main points in my speech. Firstly, about harming democracy and why independent financial institutions are an essential prerequisite for having a functioning democracy. Secondly, about risk-taking, comparative of where it happens more, and why nationalized banks are worse at this specific issue. Before that, a few extraneous points of rebuttal. Firstly, they give us a notion, in CG that says that banks currently have too low interest rates, therefore we can't reduce them lower in a time of crisis. Note that OG basically defines this debate as banks that give very preferable terms to people within them and don't seek profit. It sounds like they're already going to have very low interest rates under their model, meaning they don't actually. It gets worse under the other side of the house by OG's definition. Second, note that what they basically want to achieve, everything they want to achieve. Firstly, isn't mutually exclusive with things we can do in status quo, such as quantitative easing of the market, such as start buying, all these kinds of things we can do without nationalizing banks. But secondly, note, it doesn't necessitate nationalizing all banks. It necessitates having one national bank. And we're fine with that, and that's a status quo in many countries in the world. Third rebuttal, they tell us it's hard for the government to make the right decision about bailing out a bank. We ask, therefore, how can the government make the right decision about running a bank in the first place and making all the financial decisions? If they say they are so bad at making this specific one, we're saying they're likely to be much worse in making a whole lot of these decisions that also may be unpopular, that also may have all these problems associated with them. Let's talk about harm to democracy, because the opening opposition started with this by telling us that there can be a bad government policy that creates through the banks. What we come and tell you is that there is systematic incentive and a systematic ability for government to prejudice the entire system and to consolidate its power to actually stop the necessary conditions for democracy, for an existing democracy. Why? Because we say that a mass democracy is based on an equal ability of different political sides to get capital. Why is this the case? Because capital is what translates into political awareness, into campaign ads, into control, into media exposure. We're saying in the basis of this system of, for example, having newspapers, media channels, from different things that cost a lot of money, from different political spectrum, from across the political spectrum, of being able to build parties, and run candidates from different places in the political spectrum, relies the notion of specifically big banks. Why specifically the big ones? Because we see that smaller banks simply don't have the ability to get the required amount of capital in order to, for example, support a media channel or something of this sort, or a political party. And moreover, we're saying even if they do, they take a much higher risk doing that. Therefore, they will have much higher interest rates. They will have much higher interest rates, which means much higher entrance barrier into the political market in the first place. Now, what happens when the big banks are nationalized? We say that the people who appoint the bank managers tend to be the people currently in power in government. They are the people, and all political appointments tend to happen in this way, that you want people who implement your social policy. Therefore, the incentive of these people is naturally tied with the incentive of the people appointed. Now, we're saying moreover, this is not something that's in the media's eye. Meaning things like, for example, we've given a higher interest rate to a specific party, or a bank made specific signaling towards a certain media channel is not something you're likely to get news on. It's not sexy. Most people don't know that these sorts of things are happening, and people who are pressured in this way, like media channels, are not likely to go and report these things because they have the incentive not to do so. So what tends to happen? We don't say people are going to cut funding to parties, obviously, but we are going to see worse credit conditions being given. We're likely to see that, especially media bodies being pressured by government through the banks in order to implement those policies. For example, the ability of, if the state was now to nationalize all media, we're saying that would be terrible for democracy, right? Because all media channels, even if the government did nothing, tend to err on the side of caution, tend to report less to the people in charge of them. We're saying when you nationalize banks, you in fact nationalize media by nationalizing the credit that those media organizations get. Now we're saying, moreover, they have the big banks controlled by government even have a way to have ways of pressuring the smaller banks in order to stop them from giving those credits to political competitors. So we're saying we allow much less accountability for equal representation. We allow much less accountability for equal reporting for different sites. We allow much less. We highly increase the entrance barriers to the political market, specifically for minorities, specifically for people who do not have themselves the cash in order to do this. We make it significantly harder for media to do all these things. Before I go on, I'll take over.
Okay, we explicitly told you that we would allow credit unions and small financial institutions that weren't systemically important. The difference is we can do the good policies that you guys want because you don't have these organizations that are so entrenched in the economy they can entirely.
Thank you very much. What we explained to you is that specifically big banks are the ones that are necessary in order to fund a news channel or to fund a political party. The small credit hedge funds are not enough in order to do those specific things, and if they do, they have the huge interest rates which we just explained. Let's talk about worse risk taking. Because basically, OG come up and tell us that banks know that have a moral hazard because they can get a bailout and because since they're too big to fail. First, this is just untrue, right? Henry Paulson and the Bush administration did not bail out Lehman Brothers. They actually did collapse, as CG themselves told us. But however, you know what bank will have to be bailed out? A government-owned bank. That one you can't allow it to run. That means much more moral hazard on their side of the house. But moreover, we're saying that we have to take into consideration other factors as well in risk taking. First, we're saying the personal risk that people take upon themselves, because we say that's much lower in the public sector. Because in the private sector, nobody is going to hire a person who the CEO of Lehman Brothers anytime in the future. However, almost nobody in the federal government went home after the 2008 collapse. We're saying that civil servants know this and are much more likely to be willing to take exactly those risks. Now, also, they obviously want profit because they obviously want the business, the bank that they're running to succeed. And we're saying this is very problematic. Moreover, we're saying governments tend to be highly populistic in the way that they manage assets. If any bank had a national deficit that's much higher than its yearly budget, that it could never recover, the CEO would go home in a matter of weeks. However, most governments in the world have this problem. Therefore, we're saying governments are more likely to spend worse. Note also, governments bought also a lot of the bad shares in the 2008 crisis. We're saying governments are just bad at these specific investments. Because this destroys our access to democracy, because we get worse risk-taking, we are very proud to oppose the motion.